Hey folks, it's Saturday night. We got a snowstorm on the way, and who's crazy enough to still record a lecture about sonnets? Yeah, me. We're gonna learn a new. We're gonna meet a new author. We're gonna read a new sonnet. Sir Philip Sidney, probably my favorite sonnet writer overall. This is my favorite sonnet ever. So I guess I'm just excited to share it with you. So anyway, let's do a quick bio. One of the things I told you is the first thing you want to do when you meet a new sonnet is meet the poet, because all art is autobiography. We can't help but write about our own lives, and understanding, especially Sir Philip Sidney's love situation and what was going on with him and the woman he wrote his sonnets to, really, I think helps you understand the sonnets and the emotions he's going through and trying to put out there. So let's jump over to our good friend Wikipedia and take a look at Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney, born November 30th, 1554, died October 17th, 1586. He was 32 years old when he died. He died in battle. Actually, the story of his death is fairly tragic and worth sharing, I guess. As I mentioned in that rambly lecture I gave on all the various things that contributed to the Renaissance and sort of the historical perspective during the Renaissance, there was a war that was going on between Catholic Spain and Protestant Netherlands. And the Spanish had attacked the Netherlands and they had more power, they had more wealth, they theoretically should have been victorious in that combat, but England sided itself with Netherlands, and a number of English volunteers went over there to fight. One of the Englishmen who fought in the wars was Sir Philip Sidney, and actually he was mortally wounded on the field of battle. He got shot. I believe that the bullet penetrated his stomach lining, and so it was a slow death where he slowly leaked stomach acid into his vital organs until he died, which is horrible. But anyway, he died in that battle, I guess, famously, lying wounded on the battle. He insisted that the water that was brought to him be given to another man. So he, by all accounts, is a pretty good guy. Sir Philip Sidney's a lot different from Edmund Spenser. Sir Philip Sidney was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was rich. He came from an aristocratic family. That's why we know the date of his birth, not just the date, but the year and all of that kind of thing. He was what we call a Renaissance man. He was good at everything. He was a scholar. He was a soldier. He was a poet. He was a scientist. People could be what we call Renaissance man back in the Renaissance because science was so new that you really could learn everything there was to learn at the time about chemistry and physics and biology. You could sort of know it all. Nowadays, there's so much to know that nobody can be a Renaissance man. Nobody can know everything there is to know about everything because there's too much of it all. But Sir Philip Sidney was one of those people that was ultra educated. And it helps to be rich. He enjoyed all of his passions, and his passions were things like the arts and science and, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, his story is a little bit tragic. You can go through and you can read the Wikipedia page if you're interested. Tells you a little bit about his early life. He actually got elected to Parliament at age 18. Tells you a little bit about the connections that he has. He became a prominent figure in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. Actually got exiled for a while because he gave her marriage advice that she didn't want to hear. I guess don't give a queen marriage advice. It's a bad idea. But his most famous writings was, well, the most famous series of sonnets that he ever wrote was in a book, a sonnet sequence called Apostrophe and Stella. He's actually the first English poet to write a sonnet sequence. So what is a sonnet sequence? It turns out that, we've talked about how poems are kind of like musical songs, right? Just songs without the music, like there's just the lyrics. But what a sonnet sequence is the author is going to write a whole series of poems that tell a story. They're all connected. They're all in order. They're all on the same theme and the same topic. So it'd be like if a musical artist decided to write an album, and some of them have, in which the songs in the order that they're in are all connected and tell a story. That's what a sonnet sequence is. And Sir Philip Sidney wrote a famous sonnet sequence called Astrophil and Stella. Astrophil was the name of the young man who was in love with a young woman named Stella. Well, Astrophil translates in the Latin into star lover, and of course, Stella is star. So it was star lover and star was sort of the name of the sonnet sequence. But of course, like most sonnet writers, it was really about his own life. Sir Philip Sidney was uniquely rejected. Let me jump over here and give you some imagery to help you. So Sir Philip Sidney, like I said, scholar, poet, scientist, historian, soldier, Renaissance man, died on the battlefield. He was in love, hopelessly, by all accounts, in love with a woman named Penelope Devereux. That's her actual picture. That's his actual picture. And he wanted to marry her. In fact, they became engaged to be married. He thought his life was made. But Penelope Devereux broke off the engagement with Sir Philip Sidney and became engaged to and married a guy named Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick. She always marries the rich guy. That's how it goes, right? And he looks so, yeah, but whatever. Anyway, she ditched Sidney and married Lord Rich and broke his heart, and he never recovered. And so when he wrote his sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella, he's really Astrophil, and Stella's Penelope Devereux. And all of these sonnets, which are unrequited love sonnets, which are about a young man who's in love with a woman who doesn't love him back. They're all about this woman that was engaged to him, that he briefly enjoyed the love of, but who left him and married another man. And if you understand that background of his life and the situation he's in, I think it helps you understand the poems. There's some bitterness in these poems. There's some, I won't say blame, but there's some depression and some of those aspects that you might expect in the poems, given the situation that Sidney went through. And to some extent, maybe his death on the battlefield was a release from the pains of his own life. Certainly when you read the sonnets, you can sort of see that. So again, the sonnet sequence is called Astrophil and Stella. There's a number of sonnets in that sequence, and I'm going to ask you to do some classwork with one of them shortly. That one is Sonnet 39 from Astrophil and Stella. So this background is going to be important to you as you try for the first time to decode and understand a sonnet on your own or with a partner. But I'm going to go over one of his sonnets first to give you a sense of the way Sidney constructs his sonnets, the kinds of devices that he uses, the order that he puts things in. So hopefully that will help you as you go and decode a different one of his sonnets. So we're going to jump over to this sonnet, which is called Thou Blind Man's Mark. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute, Howard. You told me that sonnets had numbers. They didn't have titles. And here's one with a title. Okay, yeah, you're right. That's true. This one is sort of an exception. And I guess that's one of the reasons I like it as well. It's called Thou Blind Man's Mark, but it isn't. That's just the first 4 words of the poem. If you go down and look at the actual text of the poem, it's Thou Blind Man's Mark. This is a very unique poem because it was not published during Sir Philip Sidney's life. It was found among his things after he died. And so we cannot know what number sonnet it was because it was never published. So we can't put a number on it. And they decided to name it by its first 4 words instead. So it's called Thou Blind Man's Mark. But it's clearly still about his situation with Penelope and still in line with the kinds of poems he had been writing in Astrophil and Stella. So anyway, that's sort of the story of this poem. It's a poem he was still working on when he died, and he had not yet decided to publish. Maybe it was too raw, maybe it was too real to him. I don't know. Whatever the case, we're going to read it and we're going to look at it. So first thing you want to do is make sure it's a sonnet. I told you it was a sonnet, but let's double check. Remember that sonnets, if we go back, are 14-line poems written in iambic pentameter with an intricate rhyme scheme, usually about love. Oops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 lines. Iambic pentameter. Thou blind man's mark, thou fool self-chosen snare. Fond fancies, scum, and dregs of scattered thought. All right, 10, both those. Band of all evils, cradle of causeless care. Well, maybe I read that wrong. Band of all evils, cradle of causeless. Yep, 10. Thou web of will, whose end is never wrought. Yeah, so it's iambic pentameter. What about the rhyme scheme? Usually they have a complicated rhyme scheme, and as you've seen in the last 2 poems we've gone through, it's important to identify the rhyme scheme because the rhyme scheme gives you an idea of the units of meaning. Just a quick review on rhyme scheme, back to our terms. If it's 14 lines, it's going to be composed of poetic units. Those units can be composed of couplets, 2-line rhyming groups, quatrains, 4-line rhyming groups, sestets, 6-line rhyming groups, or octaves, 8-line rhyming groups. And you've got to put it together to try and figure out what the rhyme scheme is. We've looked at 3 rhyme schemes here. We'll see if this fits any of them. So let's go through that. Snare, that's always going to be our A, whatever the first one is. Thought, doesn't rhyme with snare, it's a B. Why is it bold? I don't know. Care is going to be, I guess for some reason they're going to be bold, but whatever. Care is going to be an A. Wrought goes with thought, so that's a B. Bought goes with thought, so that's a B. Why are some of them bolded and some of them not? It's killing me. Where goes with snare, that's an A. Brought goes with bought, that's a B. Prepare goes with where, that's an A. Sought goes with bought, that's a B. Aspire, hey, that's a new one, right? That's got to be C. Fire goes with aspire, that's a C. Taught goes back to bought. Hire is a C. Desire is a C. Hold on, I'm going to fix those bolds because they're driving me nuts. All right, we're back. So look at this rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, B, A, B, A, B, C, C, B, C, C. That's not anything we've seen before. This is new. This is something Sidney invented himself. How do we separate this? I mean, I'm looking at it and you're like A, B, A, B, B, A, B, A. That's probably an octave, and BCC, BCC is a sestet. And if we're looking for where the thought ends, where's the first period in this first sentence? Yep, it ends at the end of the octave. So that octave is our first, paragraph in this 2-paragraph essay. And this one, the only period is at the end. So our sestet is the second one. So we're going to have sort of that Petrarchan, you go back to your lit terms and your types of sonnets. A Petrarchan sonnet is an octave and a sestet. And Sidney's given us an octave and a sestet, but it's a slightly different rhyme scheme. In fact, it's a more intense rhyme scheme. He pulls this out with only 3 rhymes, 14 lines, only 3 rhymes. That's crazy. I guess maybe because I've read so many sonnets, I understand how impossibly difficult that is. And he pulls it off here, which is just amazing to me. So cool. We've now identified the 2 units of meaning here. And it's definitely a sonnet by our definition. We have to read it, though, to know if it's really about love and about unrequited love. So let's just read it. We're just going to read it to listen to it for one time through, and then we'll go through and we'll try and identify the meaning and what's going on and talk about that. So, Thou Blind Man's Mark by Sir Philip Sidney. Thou blind man's mark, thou fool's self-chosen snare, fond fancy's scum and dregs of scattered thought, band of all evils, cradle of causeless care, thou web of will whose end is never wrought. Desire I have too dearly bought, with price of mangled mind thy worthless ware. Too long asleep thou hast me brought, who should my mind to higher things prepare, but yet in vain thou hast my ruin sought. In vain thou madest me to vain things aspire. In vain thou kindled all thy smoky fire. For virtue hath this better lesson taught, within myself to seek my only hire, desiring naught but how to kill desire. Okay, so one thing that I can do here to help you out is I can take a bunch of this old language and help you modernize it. Thou is the old way of saying you. So anytime you see thou there, you can sort of mentally replace it with you. You blind man's mark, you fool, self-chosen stare, fond fancy, scum, and dregs of scattered thought. Like you go through, you web of will, whose end is never wrought, right? So that's pretty clear. So thou is going to be you, and you'll want to keep track of that and know that. Let's see. Thou hast. Hast is an old word for has. So you can fix that in your mind too. Hast means has. Shouldst, again, is an old word for should. He's using sort of old, like King James Bible-y kind of language here. But yet in vain, thou, that's you. Hast, have. My ruin sought. In vain, you madest, made, right? Me. So if you see these STs on the end, the word is made or has or have. In vain, you kindled all your. Thy is your, for what that's worth. Your smoky fire for virtue has this better lesson taught within myself to seek my only higher, desiring not. Not is nothing. Nothing but how to kill desire. So I'm going to read it one time for you in a modernized language way so that you can sort of hear it without all these weird biblical sounding things going on. And then we'll go through and we'll look at the meaning. You blind man's mark, you fool's self-chosen snare, fond fancy scum and dregs of scattered thought, band of all evils, cradle of causeless care, you web of will whose end is never wrought, desire, I have too dearly bought with price of mangled mind your worthless ware, too long asleep you have me brought, who should my mind to higher things prepare, but yet in vain you have my ruin sought. In vain you made me to vain things aspire. In vain you kindled all your smoky fire. For virtue has this better lesson taught within myself to seek my only higher, desiring nothing but how to kill desire. That's a beautiful poem. Maybe I just got goosebumps reading it. But wow. So let's break it down. First thing you need to look at with Thou Blind Man's Mark is, we'll move past Lord Rich here. We'll look at the two parts. The octave. First thing you need to know is that it starts out with a series of metaphors and what we call an apostrophe. We all know what metaphors are when something, a comparison that does not use like or as. And you can see it here, you blind man's mark. He's calling something the blind man's mark. You fool self-chosen snare. He's calling something, a self-chosen snare. And then there's a whole list. He's calling whatever this thing is, fond fancy scum. He's calling it the dregs of scattered thought. He's calling it the band of all evils. He's calling it a cradle of causeless care. We're going to have to look at each of these and know what they mean. He calls it a web of will whose end is never wrought. Well, what is this thing he's talking to? It turns out that you only find out down here in line 5. Desire. So it turns out that Sidney is talking to desire, which you might be like, well, that's just silly. Why would anybody talk to something like desire that can never respond and cannot answer him? It turns out it's a new literary term that you have not learned yet. So let's pause and go down here to figurative language and add a new term for you. This is what's called apostrophe. Now, I know you tend to think of apostrophe as this little grammatical guy right here. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know why they both have the same name. They do. If I could go back in time and shank whoever named them the same thing, I would. So we could have two different names. But I can't. So apostrophe as a literary term means talking to something that cannot respond. In this case, Sir Phillip Sidney is talking to desire. Like having a conversation with desire. And you're like, well, that's kind of crazy. Is this guy like out of his mind? I mean, I guess grief and sorrow and depression might be able to do that to you, but it's not as crazy as you think. We use apostrophe all the time. Let me give you some examples. Your alarm clock goes off in the morning and you turn to it and you say, shut up. Right. That was you talking to your clock, or in this case, your phone, because that's where your alarm is. Is your phone going to respond? No, but you talk to it. Are you crazy? No. All right, you're driving in the car with your mom or dad, and they're driving, and somebody cuts them off on 66. You better believe they start talking to that car in front of them. Can the person hear? No. Do they do it anyway? Apostrophe. You're watching a sporting event and your team's doing really well and you start shouting at the screen. Can the athlete hear you? No. Is it going to respond? No. It's apostrophe. You talk to your pets. In a more somber way, you ever gone to a gravestone and talked to somebody who's dead? Talk to God. Like you don't generally get responses, in a verbal way from any of those. We sometimes feel like we have nonverbal responses, but when something can't respond and you talk to it anyway, it's called apostrophe, and that is something that Renaissance poets are going to use. So it's a new piece of figurative language. Remember, figurative language is anything that isn't literally happening; it's figuratively happening. So these poems aren't really being said. It's not like he's literally talking. I think sonnets are a little bit like soliloquies in plays. They're the thoughts of the poet, put down on paper. So anyway, let's go back to that blind man's mark, and now we can really start digging into this octave. When you have an octave poem, it's a little harder to interpret. As you've noticed, quatrain poems, you can break it down. You can look at 4 lines at a time and understand what's going on, and that's that, and it's pretty simple. But in octave, you got to internalize and understand 8 lines at once, and it can feel a little overwhelming. So we're going to try and take it maybe even half a line at a time and make sure that we understand what's going on. So the first line says, "You blind man's mark," and that's the name of the title. Well, what does he mean by a blind man's mark? A mark is what you're trying to shoot at. So this is an archery metaphor. A mark is a target, and the blind man's mark. We know that he's talking to desire. So he's saying that desire is a target that a blind man shoots at. Now that's an interesting idea, because is a blind man ever going to hit a target? No. And of course, this is a love poem, and the phrase "love is blind" is a classic saying. Also, archery and love are associated through a guy named Cupid. So, we got sort of this image in the beginning that somebody who desires somebody else, who loves somebody else, they're like a blind person trying to shoot at a target. They don't really know what they're shooting at. They have these desires, but are they going to achieve them? Are they achievable? Do we ever stop and think about whether our desires are achievable? And the fact that they are or are not achievable, does that stop us from wanting them? And he backs that up with a second metaphor. These are all metaphors, like I said in the document here. The octave is metaphors, lots of them. They come thick and fast, one after the other. So love is, or desire is, a blind man's mark. It's a target that blind men shoot at and can't possibly hit, and yet they keep shooting. Desire is a fool's self-chosen snare. So he says desire it's a trap. It's a trap that we set for ourselves and then walk into. When you desire something or someone, you've baited your own hook and bitten it. You've trapped yourself. You've ensnared yourself. You chose the thing you wanted to desire, and then you started desiring it. So that's interesting. Then he calls it fond fancy scum and the dregs of scattered thought. That's a more complicated series of metaphors, but they both work. Scum is like on a pond where the water is still or stagnant and the top of it gets all covered with gross algae and stuff like that. That would be scum. And fancy in this case, when you fancy somebody, it's to desire somebody or to take a liking to somebody. And so he's saying desire is to love what that scum on the top of a pond is to water. Clear, perfect water, that is love. Desire is the gross stuff on the top of the pond. He also calls desire the dregs of scattered thought. Dregs is a word you may or may not know. It goes back to tea and wine. The British like their tea. When you drink tea, but it doesn't come in a little tea bag, you put the tea leaves in and you drink down to where the little crumbled bits of tea leaves are at the bottom of the cup. That's the dregs. right? Nobody drinks the tea leaves; they're gross. Similarly, if you're mulling wine, like people crush the grapes right in that vat with their feet. Well, nowadays we have really good filtration systems, and everything gets filtered out. But back in the Renaissance, every bottle of wine had a little bit at the bottom that was called the dregs. I guess a more modern way to talk about dregs. Did you ever buy a orange juice bottle that has pulp in it? I kind of like pulp, but a lot of people don't. And my son hates pulp. And if I accidentally buy an orange juice with pulp in it, he never shakes it up because shaking it up gets the pulp in there. And so he keeps pouring it out. And eventually, all you have left is like this solid, thick block of pulp at the bottom. And that is the dregs. Nobody wants to drink that. And so, what he is saying is if all of your thoughts represent, I don't know, the orange juice bottle, then desire, the thoughts that you spend wanting things that you can't have, those are the dregs. Those are the pulpy, nasty bits of thought. It's kind of a hard metaphor to swing with, and we're starting out with these right out of the gate, so it takes a little bit of mental effort to understand them. But he gives you a bunch of them, and when you put them together, I think they make a pretty clear picture of what he's trying to say about desire. He calls desire the band of all evils, which is essentially, I think, going back maybe to the Pardoner's Tale and some of the things we talked about with the Canterbury Tales, the Pardoner said that the desire, the love of money was the root of all evil. But Sidney's taken us a step farther out. He's not even saying it's money. He's saying that the root of all evil is desire. If people didn't want things, if people didn't lust for things, whether it's gold or somebody else or power or whatever it happens to be, then we might live in a world without evil. All evils are rooted in desire, according to Sidney. And then he calls desire also a cradle of causeless care. That word cradle, I think, is interesting. That's something that houses a baby. And in this case, care is worry. And so essentially he says that desire is like a baby that we nurture and grow and worry and fret over. We spend all of our waking hours consumed with growing our desires and wanting to fulfill them. And so this idea that it's causeless too. You don't have to desire these things. You could just, I don't know, somehow free yourself from your desires, and you wouldn't have to spend all of your time and mental energy and anguish worrying about the things that you want that you don't have. Then he calls it a web of will whose end is never wrought. So in this case, it's like you're a spider, or desire's a spider, and you decide to build a web. And you just keep building and building and building, and it's a web that will never be finished, because it turns out that when you start desiring things, and you get that thing, it doesn't stop you from desiring things. You just move on to desiring new and different things. And so once you give into desire, you've given into the root of all evil, and you're spending your life wishing and wanting and never being satisfied. You can never come to the end of it. I think that's all interesting. So now he's given us all of these without telling us it's desire. We only find out it's desire in the next line. And so I think that the first time readers of this poem are trying to figure out it's almost like a riddle, what he's talking about at the beginning. He's got this riddle language. But then he tells us, desire, desire, I have too dearly bought. With price of mangled mind, your worthless wear. So he says desire is an object that is worthless. It doesn't bring you any happiness. It only ever brings you sorrow. And you buy it with your sanity. You buy it with your peace of mind. That's the price. The price of desiring something is your peace of mind. And he willingly did it. He went off and he paid his peace of mind for these desires that he wants. Now remember, let's go back to the backstory. We know that Sir Phillip Sidney is in love with Penelope Devereux. We know that she left him and married Lord Rich, and that he still desires to be with her, even though she is no longer available to him. And, clearly when you read this poem, he knows he should be over her. He knows she is married. He knows he needs to move on, but he doesn't have control of his desires. Right? And so when you go back and you look at this, a blind man's mark, you can't hit that mark. It's impossible. A blind man's not going to hit the target. Fool's self-chosen snare. He decided to fall in love with her, and he walked into that trap. He chose it for himself. He's trapped in his own web of will. He doesn't have the willpower to get out of it, and the end is never wrought. He can never get to a satisfactory conclusion in this relationship because she's married. So anyway, he says, desire, desire, I've too dearly bought with price of mangled mind your worthless ware. Too long, asleep you have me brought, who should my mind to higher things prepare. So when he makes this metaphor here about the mangled mind, he's destroyed his own peace of mind. He can no longer do what he wants to do. Remember that Sir Phillip Sidney is a scholar and a soldier and an artist and a scientist, and he says, I should be spending my mental energy on so many other things, but I'm asleep to all of those other things. All I can think about are my desires. I should be aspiring to higher things. I like that he's got that in there, aspire. But instead, he's stuck on Penelope. So that's your octave. And in fact, before we jump into the sestet, the sound devices in here. Remember, you go back to your Renaissance terms list and we looked at sound devices, alliteration, consonants, assonance. Let's just stop and just in this octave, just in the beginning bit of the poem, let's look at what he's got here. Thou blind man's mark. Man's mark is alliteration. Thou fool's self-chosen snare. Self and snare. So we got two pair of alliterations there. Fond fancies. We got alliterations there. Scum and dregs of scattered thought. We got scattered and scum, both being S's. So every line so far has had at least two alliterations. Band of all evils. All right, well, that's not as clear, but cradle of causeless care is alliteration. Web of will. Whose, that's not really will, whose, that's not the same sound, but wrought is a W as well. Whose end is never wrought. Desire, that's repetition. I have too dearly bought, but because it's matched with dearly, we end up with 3 D sounds here. With price of mangled mind. Can you see all of the alliterations? This is very intentional. Mangled mind, worthless ware. I mean, these are words that are right next to each other. And the alliteration is all over the place here. Too long, asleep thou hast me brought, who shouldst my mind. Wait, do we have a line without any alliteration in it? Too long, we have a little bit of repetition there. Yeah, I think we do. Okay, so we've got a lot of alliteration, but you also need to look at consonants and assonants. We can look at, I don't see a lot in this first line. Fancies ends with an S sound, and dregs ends with an S sound, and ends with a D. Fond ends with a D, and scattered ends with a D. So we've got a lot of sounds that are repeating at the ends of words there. Evils ends with a S. Causeless ends with a S. Whose ends with a S sound. And is ends with a S sound. Desire, that's ours. I don't see anything here. With price is an S. Mangled Mind. Look at Mangled Mind. Ooh, what did I just do? Mangled ends with a D and mind ends with a D. So clearly we got that going on. Too long asleep. Thou hast ends with that T sound, hast. And brought, also same thing. And shouldst, well, that would go with hast and brought. So, and hire and prepare both end with an R sound. And I don't want to bore you and suddenly jump into assonance as well, but we could look at that if we wanted to. He's got a lot of sound devices in here. I'm not going to do the sound devices in the second stanza because we've already done them here, and actually it's all one stanza in the sestet. So far we've started out with a series of metaphors. Now, blind man's mark. In fact, let's just list the metaphors. 1, blind man's mark, fool's self-chosen snare. 2, fond fancy scum. 3, dregs of scattered thought. 4, band of all evils. 5, cradle of causeless care. 6, web of will. 7. We've got 7 metaphors opening up this thing. Then we also have the apostrophe talking to desire. We've got this metaphorical sense of desire being a good that you buy in a shop, and the price tag on it is your sanity. And yet it turns out to be worthless. So it's kind of like a curse, and that he should be spending his time thinking about other things, but instead he's spending his time thinking about his desires. So let's jump to the sestet and look at what's going on here. He says, but yet, and it's almost a reply, which is the way that Petrarch did these things, but yet in vain thou has my ruin sought. In vain you made me to vain things aspire. In vain you kindled all your smoky fire. Okay, so let's just start with those 3 lines. I think that's a good way to do it. We've got the word vain here repeated a lot. He's got it 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 repetitions of vain. So in vain, when something is in vain, you try to do something but fail. And so here he says, in vain you, he's still talking to desire, it's still an apostrophe, you have my ruin sought. So he says desire's trying to ruin him, but desire has done this in vain. So here's hope. That first octave was really hopeless. All of a sudden he's like, yeah, you failed, desire. It has not worked. In vain you made me to vain things aspire. Now we have the reverse meanings, or the double meaning, especially on this one. Those first 2 are the meaning of vain, where you try to do something and it's in vain, it doesn't work. This one has both the in vain meaning, but also the vanity meaning. So in vain you made me to vain things aspire. So he was spending his time, and this is all past tense all of a sudden, he was spending his time on desire, desiring things that were impossible to achieve, but also things that flattered his vanity. He wanted to be with Penelope. Maybe on some level, when she decided to marry Lord Rich, he felt that as an insult and wanted to get her back because she rejected him. And so there's an element of vanity in there as well. But yes, it was something that could never be achieved. And so he was wasting his time on desires for things that were impossible. So he aspired, he tried to achieve vain things. In vain, you kindled all your smoky fire. So here's a symbol. I'm just going to highlight that in, I don't know, how about blue? So here's a symbol, smoky fire. We know that fire from a lot of other poems, but specifically a Spenser one that we just read, often represents passion, right? Passion in a love relationship. But fire also goes back to Prometheus and some of those Greek myths, and it's representative of knowledge, the light of knowledge, what separates human beings from the animals. Well, we control fire. And so fire is a really interesting symbol. Fire does 2 things. It produces heat and light. Light is knowledge in the darkness, and heat, warms you. And so the passion comes from sort of that heat idea, and the knowledge comes from that light idea. But this fire that he talks about, desire kindling, is a smoky fire. And I think that's what's really important. It turns out that if you have a fire and you try and build it with like wet wood, anybody who's ever tried to do this, it just produces a lot of smoke. And the smoke that it produces actually clouds your vision and takes away from the light that it would produce. And the smoke actually uses up a lot of the energy and takes away or detracts from the heat that it would produce. So a smoky fire is a fire that's burning, but it's not doing the kinds of things that fire needs to do to be efficient and productive. So this goes back to some of the earlier sort of metaphorical things he was saying. I think the symbol, the idea is that if love is a fire, if passion is a fire, it's a burning, like a pure passion is a burning, bright fire that produces heat and warmth. Two things humans need to survive, and light to see. But the smoky fire of desire, this isn't love. This is desire, and it clouds. It might make you blind. Oh, let's go back to the beginning. Thou blind man's mark. It makes it hard to see. Desire actually clouds your vision. Desire actually leaves you cold instead of warm. It's a smoky fire. You think it's good for you because fire is something that, you know, has helped humanity through the years, but this one is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. So you kindled your smoky fire. I think that smoky fire then is a symbol of desire and the way desire works in this poem. So then he concludes for virtue. Now virtue is the opposite of all these things he has shown before. Virtue has this better lesson taught. So at the end he says, I learned a better lesson. Within myself to seek my only higher, desiring nothing but how to kill desire. So he says, I've learned my lesson. I've spent my time with desire. I've realized that it's worthless. I've realized that it's valueless. I'm tired of paying desire every day of my life for its worthless product. He says, I've learned this lesson, and the lesson is to look within myself and pay myself instead of paying my mind to desire. And the only desire that I have left is the desire to kill desire. He wants to live a life, it's sort of Buddhist in the end here. He wants to live a life in which he has purged desire from himself entirely. And he says, if you have a desire, the one desire you should have is to free yourself from desire. And it ends on this really powerful, upbeat note where he has found a resolution to the problems that have plagued him. The problem is that this is a paradox. Desiring nothing but to kill desire. I mean, I guess that's a pure desire, but it's still a desire. And so it leaves you as the reader, I think intentionally, with this question: is it possible to fully free yourself from desire? I mean, isn't desiring to kill desire still a desire? Can you ever be free of desire? Is it something that's part of being human? I don't know, but I do know that this is a great poem. And I've talked about it for 40 minutes, and I really, that's too long. So I'm going to shut up and shut this thing off. But before I do, let me read it to you one more time and think about all these things that I've said. And, there's a ton of sound devices in that sestet too, but I'm not going to go over them. So let me just read it to you one more time. I'll use the modernized English, and I think you can appreciate this sonnet and think about Sidney's life and how it connects and all of the themes and what he's saying about desire and then replying to desire sort of in the end. Okay. Thou blind man's mark. You blind man's mark, you fool's self-chosen snare, fond fancy scum and dregs of scattered thought, band of all evils, cradle of causeless care, you web of will whose end is never wrought, desire I have too dearly bought with price of mangled mind, your worthless ware, too long asleep you have me brought, whom should my mind to higher things prepare, but yet in vain you have my ruin sought, in vain you made me to vain things aspire, in vain you kindled all your smoky fire, for virtue has this better lesson taught, within myself to seek my only higher, desiring nothing but how to kill desire. Boom.